The Foundation, Student, Sport, Recreational, and Private Pilot Training. Hello, this is Forrest Owens. I'm an aviation lawyer, a private pilot, and FAA licensed airframe and power plant mechanic. Let's begin with the foundational point. The FAA does not treat pilot training as one generic course. It treats pilot training as a ladder. Each rung adds privilege only after the applicant satisfies three separate categories of requirements: eligibility, aeronautical knowledge, and flight proficiency, and aeronautical experience. The framework lives primarily in 14 CFR Part 61. It is also shaped by Part 141 for FAA certified pilot schools with approved syllabus. And that distinction matters immediately because one of the most common misunderstandings in flight training is assuming that every certificate has one fixed hour requirement. It does not. Under Part 61, the minimums are one thing. Under approved Part 141 curriculum, the minimums may be lower because the school is operating under a structured FAA approved course. For most flight students, the first legal step is the Student Pilot Certificate under Section 61.83. The applicant must generally be at least 16 years old or 14 for glider or balloon operation and must be able to read, speak, write, and understand English. But the student certificate is not permission to go flying alone whenever the student feels ready. The solo rules in Section 61.87 are where the real gatekeeping begins. Before first solo, the student must receive and log training in the make model to be flown, pass a pre-solo aeronautical knowledge test, demonstrate proficiency, and receive the instructor's endorsement. In practical terms, that means a student does not solo because of confidence. A student solos because the regulations require documented instruction, testing, and endorsement. A simple example makes this real. Suppose a 16-year-old training in a Cessna 172 has 10 hours and feels comfortable in the pattern. The student cannot legally solo until the instructor has covered the pre-solo knowledge areas, the required flight maneuvers, and signed the endorsement. The FAA system is not built on the student saying, "I think I'm ready." It's built on the instructor saying, "I have trained this person, tested this person, and I'm willing to place my certificate behind that judgment." Now, move to the first certificate level many people discuss today. Sport pilot. Sport pilot is often described casually as an easy path. That is too simplistic. It is a limited path, not a careless path. Under Subpart J, the applicant generally must be at least 17, pass both the knowledge and practical tests, and meet the aeronautical experience requirements in Section 61.313. The attraction, of course, is that in qualifying circumstances, a pilot may exercise sport pilot privileges using a U.S. driver's license rather than a traditional FAA medical certificate. But the price of that simplicity is limitation. Section 61.315 sharply limits what the sport pilot may do. No more than one passenger, generally day VFR only unless additional privileges are earned. No compensation or hire, and operations only within the aircraft's performance and design limits the regulations allow. So, the memorable point is this: sport pilot reduces the medical burden, but it does not reduce the FAA's expectations of training, testing, and operating discipline. Next is the Recreational Pilot Certificate, which still exists but has become comparatively uncommon. The reason is practical. Recreational pilots require more than sport, but gives much less flexibility than private pilot. Under section 61.99, the minimum airplane experience is 30 hours, including instructor training and solo training. But the privileges are tightly constrained under section 61.101. In everyday terms, the certificate can feel like a legal cul-de-sac. That is why many instructors and students bypass it and go directly to private pilot. And that brings us to the private pilot certificate, which remains the core FAA entry point for serious manned aircraft training. Under section 61.101 through 61.109, the applicant must generally be at least 17, receive and log required knowledge and proficiency training, pass the FAA knowledge test, pass the practical test, and meet the aeronautical experience minimums. For airplane single engine rated under Part 61, that usually means at least 40 hours of flight time, including at least 20 hours of training from an instructor and 10 hours of solo time. Under an approved Part 141 course, Appendix B allows a more structured private pilot course with lower minimum flight time, which is one reason students often hear the phrase Part 141 minimum at university and academic programs. Here is the operational point that students miss. The private pilot certificate is not simply permission to carry passengers. It is the FAA's recognition that the applicant can now act as pilot in command of a broad range of non-commercial operations. That is why the training includes cross-country planning, night training, takeoff and landings, emergency operations, weather judgment, and decision making. The agency is not issuing a souvenir. It is issuing licensing command authority. So, if you want the clean framework, it is this. The student certificate authorizes supervised progress. Sport and recreational offer limited endpoints. And private pilot is the first full practical license to command the aircraft in the national airspace. And here's something to remember. In the FAA's eyes, early pilot training is not about collecting hours. It is about earning progressively broader legal authority through documented judgment. The middle rungs, instrument commercial and the professional transition. Now, let's turn to the middle of the ladder, because this is where pilot training stops being primarily about learning to fly the airplane and starts becoming about learning to manage the system. The first major step after private pilot is usually the instrument rating. Legally, the instrument rating is not a new certificate. It is an added rating, but practically it changes everything. Under 14 CFR section 6165, the applicant must generally hold or concurrently seek a private pilot certificate in the appropriate category and class, receiving instrument ground and flight training, pass the instrument knowledge test, pass the practical test, and log the required instrument experience. For aircraft applicants under Part 61, that includes 50 hours of cross-country flight time as pilot in command and 40 hours of actual or simulated instrument time, with specific training and recent test prep requirements. Under a Part 141 instrument course, Appendix C provides an FAA approved pathway with structured ground and flight minimums. Why does the FAA care so much here? Because instrument flying is where the legal system and the physical environment collide or intersect. A FAA or a VFR pilot can often see the problem developing. An IFR pilot may have to manage clouds, procedures, automation, air traffic control, and appropriate tolerances with no outside horizon at all. So the FAA does not treat the instrument rating as a cosmetic add-on. It treats it as a proof of precision. The next rung is commercial pilot. And here is another common misunderstanding. A commercial certificate does not mean the pilot is airline ready. It means the pilot may act as pilot for compensation or hire within the privileges and limitations of the certificate and the operating rules that apply. Under Section 61.123 through 61.129, the applicant must generally be at least 18, hold at least a private pilot certificate, receive the required training, and pass the knowledge and practice tests, and satisfy substantial aeronautical experience requirements. For an airplane single engine rating under Part 61, that usually means at least 250 hours of flight time, with detailed requirements for pilot and command time, cross-country time, instrument training, training in a technically advanced airplane or complex airplane, and long cross-country experience. Under Part 141, Appendix D allows a structured course that can reduce the total hour minimum, but only within an FAA approved curriculum. A practical example helps. Imagine two pilots who can both hand fly a smooth landing. One has 60 hours and a new private certificate. The other has 250 hours, commercial maneuver training, instrument experience, advanced aircraft training, and long cross-country exposure. They may both be able to land the airplane, but the FAA is certifying something broader than stick and rudder elegance. It is certifying the pilot's exposure to workload, planning, and repetition, and operational maturity. This is also where multi-engine training often enters the picture. A multi-engine class rating is not just another airplane. It introduces asymmetric thrust, engine out control, performance degradation, and decision-making under pressure. Depending on the path, a pilot may add the multi-engine class at the private or commercial level, but from a professional standpoint, it often becomes essential before advanced turbine and airline training. There is also a medical point that students routinely misunderstand. Under Section 61.23, a private pilot, recreational pilot, or student pilot generally needs at least a third-class medical unless operating under an applicable alternative such as basic med or certain sport pilot provisions. A commercial pilot generally needs at least a second-class medical when exercising commercial privileges, and airline transport pilot privileges at the highest level trigger first-class medical requirements for many operations. In other words, as privileges expand, the medical burden usually rises with them. This is not a side issue. It is part of the certification architecture. The middle of the ladder is also where training failures usually arise, not because students are unintelligent, but because they underestimate how much of professional flying is procedural. Instrument students fall behind because they chase approaches before they master scan discipline. Commercial students fall behind because they focus on total hours and ignore precision, systems management, and consistency. The FAA's testing structure, especially through the Airman Certification Standards, is designed to prevent that shortcutting. The agency wants knowledge, risk management, and skill all tied together. So, the professional transition is not merely more time, it is a different kind of competence. Private pilot teaches lawful command in ordinary conditions. Instrument teaches disciplined control without outside visual references. Commercial teaches performance, precision, and legal readiness for competent operation. Remember this, the middle rung of FAA training is where a pilot stops being just an operator of the aircraft and starts becoming a manager of workload, procedure, and risk. The top of the ladder, flight instructor, ATP, type ratings, and the real training roadmap. Finally, let's discuss the top of the ladder because this is where the FAA's pilot training framework becomes unmistakably professional. Let's start with the flight instructor certificate. A great many pilots think of flight instructing as something you do only to build time. The FAA does not see it that way. Under Subpart H, the flight instructor certificate is its own professional credential. 14 CFR Section 61.183 establishes eligibility requirements. Section 61.185 prescribes the aeronautical knowledge areas. Section 61.187 addresses flight proficiency. And Section 61.195 imposes meaningful limitations on what an instructor may endorse or teach. That last point matters. The FAA regulates instructors not just because they teach, but because they are the gatekeepers. They authorize solos, they authorize practical tests, they create the logbook endorsements that unlock the next certificate or rating. In a very real sense, the FAA outsources part of the certification judgment to instructors, then regulates those instructors accordingly. Consider a practical example. When a flight instructor signs a student for the first solo or endorsement, a private pilot applicant for that first practical test, the signature is not ceremonial. It is a regulatory act. It tells the FAA the instructor has reviewed the required knowledge, observed the required proficiency, and believes the applicant meets the legal standard to proceed. That is why sloppy endorsements and weak documentation cause so much trouble. In FAA training, paperwork is not separate from competence. It is part of competence. Now, move to the top certificate, Airline Transport Pilot, or ATP. Under Section 61.153 through 61.159, the ATP applicant generally must be at least 23 years old for an unrestricted ATP. Read, speak, write, and understand English, hold a commercial pilot certificate and instrument rating, pass the ATP knowledge and practical tests, and satisfy the substantial aeronautical experience requirements for ATP under Section 61.159, which generally requires 1,500 hours of total time, including specific amounts of cross-country, night instrument, and pilot and command time. There is also the restricted ATP pathway in Section 61.160, which, in certain circumstances, allows an applicant to qualify at a lower total time threshold, such as military and qualifying academic programs. That is why the phrase 1,500 hours is generally correct, but not universally complete. There is another major ATP gate, the ATP Certification Training Program. For multi-engine aircraft ATP applicants, Section 61.156 requires a graduation certificate from an authorized training provider before the applicant may even take the ATP knowledge test. The regulation requires academic training and simulator training, including high altitude aerodynamics, meteorology, air carrier operations, stall prevention and recovery, upset training, and professionalism. The FAA's message is obvious. Before issuing the highest pilot certificate, the agency wants training that looks less like individual flight lessons and more like systems level transport category preparation. And then there's the issue of type ratings. Under Section 61.31, a pilot needs a type rating to serve as pilot in command of a large aircraft, turbojet-powered airplane, or other aircraft when the administrator requires it through type certification procedures. This is critically important for anyone looking at business aviation or airline operations. A commercial certificate with multi-engine privileges does not by itself authorize command of a Gulfstream, Challenger, Falcon, or Boeing. The pilot must complete make and model specific type training and pass the associated practical test. This is why advanced pilot training becomes increasingly aircraft specific as the aircraft becomes more complex. So, what does the real FAA training roadmap look like in practice? For many pilots, it is student certification, private pilot, instrument rating, commercial pilot, multi-engine rating, flight instructor, and perhaps instrument instructor. Then ATP or one or more type ratings. But the crucial point is that this is not a social custom. It is a regulatory staircase, and each step exists because the FAA has decided that the next level of authority requires a deeper level of proven competence. I would also make one final cautionary point. Minimums are legal minimums. They are not promises of readiness. A private pilot with 40 hours may be legal and still need more training to be truly confident. A commercial pilot at 250 hours may be legal and still they may be immature in judgment. An ATP candidate with 1,500 hours may satisfy the hour requirement and still needs substantial polishing in turbine procedures and crew discipline. The FAA tells you what is necessary for certification. It does not tell you what is sufficient for excellence. So the cleanest way to understand the entire structure is this. The FAA certifies increasing responsibility, not merely increasing time. Student training proves supervised readiness. Private proves command. Instrument proves precision. Commercial proves compensated operational competence. Instructor proves gatekeeping competence. ATP proves transport level professionalism. And type ratings prove aircraft specific mastery. Here's something to take away. In FAA pilot training, every new certificate or rating is really a new grant of legal trust. The higher you climb, the more exacting that trust becomes. Thank you very much for your interest in this topic. This information is provided for informational purposes only and is not legal advice. If you have any questions, please direct them to admin@aviationlegalcounsel.com. We look forward to helping you navigate these questions and issues with precision.